Well, I would say I'm better off than my father was in almost every respect. In terms of educational opportunities. At least I don't have to work in a mill in the morning to pay for my education in the evening.
I was recently trying to watch a video on YouTube about these people from India right after India became a country in the 1960s or 1970s. They were young students and they were talking about their life and the hopes that they had for their future and the prospects that they were planning out for themselves. And I was completely enamored by this video. I was watching it and they were just explaining themselves. Being so young, they were somehow so clear and I was fully engaged with it. And then I just stopped it. And I remember immediately thinking, why did I turn it off? The whole time that I was watching it, I was fully aware of how interesting it was. Like I was really thinking really hard about everything that these kids were saying. It was like a time capsule of a whole nother world. But then I also became self-aware at the pace and how slow it was. And I started thinking, what else could I be looking at? And I stopped watching that YouTube video. Sometimes we become really self-conscious when we're perfectly engaged and enjoying something. But because it's giving us so much room to think, it then becomes inevitable that you start to think about what you're doing. That question, what am I doing, then becomes a hard stop. Oh, I should stop. I should do something else. I could be entertained quicker. And that got me thinking about this. These games that are so boring, there's a huge heft of boredom at the bottom of them. And yet, there's something about being bored that is special, that is different than how we live in our day-to-day life. There is a fear of dissatisfaction that can circle in on itself and actually lead to dissatisfaction. There's this concept of being a maximizer versus a satisficer. The idea of the satisficer is someone who finds satisfaction in the bare minimum. The maximizer is precisely the opposite. This is someone trying to maximize utility or maximize whatever hedonic joy they're chasing. Both are seeking satisfaction, but for the maximizer, the satisfaction comes from a sense of perfection or peak experience. It's two types of individuals telling two different types of stories. The satisficer is someone who tells the story, how lucky I am to even have this grain of satisfaction. I'm going to hold on to it fast. And the maximizer is one who tells a story, there's something better right around the corner, I better not miss out. The way that entertainment works right now, the ease of access to entertainment, lends itself well to getting us comfortable with being maximizers as opposed to being a satisficer. Because if you're a satisficer, you're definitely missing out. There's definitely something around the corner. I wonder if we don't actually take seriously what the future really means for us. There's this idea that you have unlimited chances to keep maximizing. Oh, I can just find all the peak experiences endlessly. I could just keep this search going. But the truth is, our lives are deeply finite. When you're constantly seeking and your time is actually limited, like truly limited, you're setting yourself up for missing out on what's actually there in front of you. Because you're finite, you have to find a disposition that lets you appreciate what you actually have access to, as opposed to what you dream you might have access to. And I know the dream is compelling. I collect lots of books, and I have it in my head, I'm going to read all of them. And I keep buying games, game after game, and I keep thinking, I'm going to play all of these games. But I have to be honest with myself that I'm really not. You can't plan your life around efficiently experiencing as many experiences as possible in order to find the perfect one. You have to plan your life in terms of neglecting things, deciding not to do things. Some of these indie games can be really irritating because it feels like it's an active waste of the viewer's time. There's a lot of artsy repetition in these kinds of works. There's a navel-gazing quality where it seems like the creator is almost embellishing their personality so much that they forgot about us. And that's certainly the cynical feeling, and I have that feeling all the time. There is an outcome on the basis of volunteering for these experiences that lets you see past the initial cynical interpretation and actually understand what the artist or creator or developer is struggling with. Some of these experiences are ways for you to struggle with them through these problems. And it's precisely the vagueness of the problem, the ambiguity at the core of the problem, that makes it a problem worth struggling with someone.
At least for me, there is some evidence that wasting time can be a good thing, in moderation. Sometimes you can waste time in a way that is therapeutic or even enlightening. A lot of people found that they had to do this around the time of the beginning of the pandemic. They were missing out on everything. Everything that they were used to experiencing, everything that they thought that they were guaranteed, every reward that they were working towards was suddenly taken away. And they had to reassess, like, well, how do I spend these moments of my life? And so a lot of people, I remember, resorted to playing a new game that was released at that time, which was Animal Crossing, which is not necessarily a wandering game, but it certainly captured people's desire to spend a lot of time in a game world and be patient with it. It forces you to spend weeks doing some basic things. It gives you long-term goals. They were sort of working out how to deal with this endless moment of tension. This moment where they simply don't know what their next goal is. They don't know when things are going to get better. They gravitated toward this experience that allowed them to simply sit and say, okay, the tension will eventually have a purpose. When I say tension, I just mean that it is hard. It's hard to be patient sometimes. But in the same way that the tension of like a bowstring is always going to have some impact eventually, people needed to practice experiencing that tension even though they did not yet know where they were going to aim. You know, a game like Death Stranding is this game that would have made a lot more sense had it come out not before the pandemic, but during it. It's a game that thematically is related very much to people being locked in their houses, but it also was just about that patience that everybody had to suddenly deal with at the same time. Sometimes when you are locked away, and sometimes when you don't have every option available to you and you don't know where to go, you can still become stronger in that moment.
These video games are ways of practicing dissatisfaction, or at least practicing how to deal with ourselves in the in-between spaces between whatever goals we have without the permanent consequence of life and having to choose a direction in life and then worrying that you're wasting your time. In a game, you can play with those same ideas or mimicry of that same feeling. It's a comforting space to deal with discomfort. Death Stranding in particular, that's like a game that plays with waste in ways that are hard to have quantified visually. Like when you watch the game, if you're someone on the side and you're just looking at it, it certainly appears as utterly rote and mundane as humanly possible. But the reality of experiencing it is one of excessive detail. That expansiveness, that wastefulness is full. Because suddenly you're looking at all the jutting rock faces, the creeks and the ups and downs and the grassy knolls and all the various parts, and you're seeing them as having value beyond merely a means from one end of the map to another. They suddenly become actual detailed parameters of your attention. They actually become things that matter. There's a lot of things about Death Stranding that actually doesn't fully pull it off. There's a lot of action in Death Stranding that I actually feel like fell a little bit short of what was actually great about the game. There's a lot about the story that I feel falls short of what is truly compelling and meditative about the game. But the game still, in spite of all of that, took a massive high-budgeted risk to take boredom and remind you where boredom can take you mentally. Because when you're actually bored, your attention suddenly gets honed in and refined on much smaller scale details in the world around you. Death Stranding was all about that. When you're walking from point A to B, you're now paying attention to where your feet are landing. The angle of your ankle became a parameter that you're considering as you're going through. The weight of your equipment, the balance that you hold over yourself, all of that starts to become really important. All of that is always existing in games. You're always like trying to move from space to space. But this game made you attentive to it. What you pay attention to is your life. If you attend to your feeling of anxiety, well then your life is anxious. And that's not to say you can just choose everything that you attend to. In fact, almost nearly impossible to choose everything that you attend to. But the fact of the matter is that everything that we call what our life is just really whatever it is that our attention is on. And that's our existence. And these games that are slower bring us to a space of needing to hone our attention. And that is a kind of practice that is real. The challenge in many ways appears through the persistent process that you're ongoingly engaging with. And it's that constant engagement with like the literal fractal nature of rocks at your feet that makes it perpetually challenging in a way that other things maybe aren't. Like a lot of other video games, the challenge is periodic. There's long stretches of ease and then challenge and then ease and then challenge. Death Stranding can make something as basic as rounding the edge of a rock a whole long set of what feels like thousands of micro challenges. It must be voluntarily chosen to give that kind of attention. And that's what a game like Death Stranding or any of these other games that wander are doing, is They're giving you opportunities to be really bored, and then you have the chance to totally walk away and miss something about that process of that journey that is special. One of the least worthwhile things that you could do is recommend something to someone, because you will have such a deeply engaged and personal experience with whatever object you're now about to recommend. And upon giving it to that person, you've already changed the meaning of that thing, because now there's all this weight of expectation on top of it. I remember early on in my relationship with my girlfriend, I wanted her to play Journey. I wanted her to play it because to me it was like one of the early experiences of playing a game that is quiet, really boring, almost aimless. There's an obvious direction of this mountain peak with the light at it, and you know that that's where you're supposed to go, but there's so much wandering in between that, and I wanted her to feel what that felt like. To me it was different, something special, and she played through the whole thing. She was extremely nice. She explained it as Journey felt very much like a game based on lack. It was a game with limited graphics built around the lack of those graphics. It was a game with limited game design built around a lack of game design, and it was a game with limited storytelling built around a lack of storytelling. When something is so readily absent as all of these factors, it can feel completely unintentional, an admitting of defeat or a kind of inexpertise that limits the creator's ability to actually deliver on something. Because why would you choose to have something missing? Why would you choose to have the graphics be so simple? Why would you choose emptiness? It could be hard to understand why emptiness could be a choice. No one wants to be swindled by a work that they invest their time and money in. It's like if you go to an art museum and you see a literal toilet seat with the author's name on it, it's perfectly rational to think this is bullshit. And you could understand why you would think that. But there is a context missing when you're not going into the experience ready to mind to actually do some of the work, to actually try to work with the author as opposed to just having the author's work delivered to you. A game like Journey is very much like that. The game actually starts feeling more like a game than it ends up. When the game first opens, it's very clear the direction you need to go. You start heading there. You can collect things, and the things that you collect give you the ability to fly more. It feels like, oh, my character's developing, they're growing. At some point, you will face off against an enemy that comes after you, and it will hurt you and take away some of your power. It feels like, okay, I have a character who's developing, who's gaining power, and who's getting hurt. I have something to fear, there's the conflict. I know where this game is going, I'm heading in this direction. As the game goes along, the gamey stuff actually starts not to matter at all. All the stuff that you collect, all the little powers and the ability to fly more and more, there's a point in the game where they just start taking that away. Turns out all that stuff you were building up to be able to fly more and more, it was only for play. It didn't have a purpose in the grand scheme of things. It was an actual waste of your time. You went and you collected all that stuff and it was for nothing. And you go into the cold and you start to freeze and you can't jump anymore. You can't do all of these things that you're used to doing. And then the game just lets you experience the freedom of flight without all the individual collectible pieces that would have led to that flight. And it becomes less about earning a reward and more about just play. Play for its own sake. Your own experimentation with freedom.
One of the beautiful things to me about that moment where you've gained all these advantages throughout the game and then it gets taken away from you is that you kind of have to contend with, you have not lost everything even when you've lost all of those things that you thought were so important, because you're left there and you're still there. I think it's key to understanding the value of wandering in games, to realize that when you don't know what is over the horizon and you don't know what your next goal is and you don't know how you're going to get past some obstacle because the game has not told you how, the value comes from you, and that value is not quantifiable. There can be something very destructive in quantifying what value you have or attempting to. Even in life, if you were to try to quantify something very valuable, something particularly abstract, like say teaching children, you have to nurture children's minds in some way. And the way that you do that is always unique to the teacher. It is unique to the student. And when you try to quantify it too much, you end up destroying people's values in favor of the value, because the value is the number. It's valuable according to this metric. Because the metric is recursive, good because it says that it's good, you've narrowed the path before people have been able to discover, like, what values do they have? What utility do they see uniquely in the world and in the circumstance that they're in?
Our nature is adaptable. It's very easy to forget how so much of our experience in relation to art or entertainment has to do with where or who we are. Like when I was a little kid, I used to watch Michael Jackson videos on repeat. I had a video cassette and someone had placed all the Michael Jackson music videos on it. I would spend something like 8 hours straight just rewatching those videos. And that was peak joy for me at age 6 or 7. If I watched those same things now, I probably couldn't bear to watch more than like 20 minutes of it. The thing hasn't changed, the music videos. What's changed is me. You can think of examples like that from all throughout your childhood, things that you adored completely, and then as you grow up, it just doesn't register the same. The thing itself hasn't changed. It suggests very strongly how much you in relation to that thing is really what matters. It's not the thing by itself. And if so much of your experience of that thing can change because of you, what is it about your experiences with things now that is dependent on your disposition? How can you voluntarily shift your view of that thing to actually see something there that was always there but perhaps you missed? It's a kind of voluntary appreciation. And there's this question of intentionality, right? Oh, you're just appreciating something that has nothing to do with what the creators intended, or oh, you're giving too much credit to the people who made the thing. What's interesting about engaging with the work is it is just you in that work. You're never with the people who make the thing. You're not really in their headspace. You never got to experience what they went through in the process of creating it. So you are always removed from the creator, no matter what. There is something to just seeing something as a separate entity to process and experimenting with process, the actual process of processing something. Experimenting with your mentality and how you think through things. Wondering about what changes about you as you move through this work, as you understand it differently and better as it goes along. What is gained by actually allowing yourself to change in that way? The game Sable is all about that choice. You're a character who's young. You're going through a ceremony that seemingly everyone in the village has gone through before, where you need to venture away from your home and out into other climates, other lands, meet a range of other cultures and villagers, explore places that might be scary, places that haven't been explored before, perhaps places that are derelict and have a long history that's now forgotten. And you do all of this and you go on this journey because part of this ceremony is that you as a young person need to experience the world in order to learn something about yourself. What you experience and what you choose to experience can help guide you to what kind of life do you want to have. Because the whole goal of the game Sable is for you to find the profession that you want to live for the rest of your life. And there's 14 different professions that you can pick from in this game. And each profession has a mask, and you meet people who wear these masks and you learn about the life that they live, and you go and you do the things that they're doing. If you meet a climber, often what they ask you to do is activities that involve climbing. If you meet someone who's wearing a bug mask, what they ask you to do is in relation to interacting with the bugs of the world. By interacting with these things, you earn the right to eventually be able to choose that mask so that you can be that thing for the rest of your life. But of course, you could not have made the choice before without going through the experience. And so the game mimics that feeling of actually experiencing something. And the actual process of experiencing something cannot be placed in a summary. It cannot just be bite-sized events that just give you immediate gratification, because immediate gratification is not the thing. The thing is slow, it's a burn, it's a grind through something. One of the most notable things about going out into the world of Sable is how empty it is. It really, really is empty, and what a confidence that the developers must have had to actually let it be empty. And there's a real aimlessness to it. You're not told how many of these places to visit. You're not told which place to visit first or last. As you go deeper and deeper into the game, you find out that you can end the game very quickly if you want to. You could just get one mask and come back to the town and the game's over. You chose your profession and you don't need to experiment with any of the other professions. And that's really what the game is acting out for you. It's performing that experience of voluntarily choosing to do something, and then you can decide not to experience it at all and miss out, just like the character can decide not to try all of the professions and miss out and still make a decision anyway. You can't bounce forever between potential possibilities of what you want to do with your life. At some point you have to settle, and this game is about settling.
A lot of the main areas that actually have challenges or camps with people to talk to, an icon never appears for them. There's something great about how much that contrasts with, for example, the typical standard Ubisoft formula that you put as many icons on the map as possible so that the player never runs out of destinations. You always know exactly where you need to go next. It's only a short sprint away and then you go on to the next thing. It's a series of beelines. It's funny how even an open world, an expansive world, like the kind that Ubisoft always delivers, can be so unopen in that way. It closes your mind, it closes your ability to make decisions for yourself, and also allow your decision to form from an experience.
The fullness of the direction is precisely what curtails your ability to experiment and understand for yourself. It becomes just about following direction. Sable is about just self-understanding. I mean, that is the whole theme of the game. And it's the consistency of theme that some of these games that wander really maintain and hold fast to. Is just, if we're going to make a game about a character exploring an unknown world, we need to have you explore. Part of exploration is a lot of nothing. Games like Sable, these games that wander, these are art for art's sake as quest structure. It's the joy of action in the savoring of beauty. Maybe that is enough. No answers, just a sky beneath your feet of glistening sand. I want to bring in this concept. It comes from this poet, John Keats. He had this concept of negative capability. This idea he came up with having to do with why is nature so intriguing to someone who doesn't actually live in nature. It's the ambiguity in nature, the fact that nature isn't designed for you, that makes you more attentive to it. Someone who is negatively capable, which is what he felt a poet should be, is having this negative capacity to allow for absence to actually be filled by you as opposed to being harrowing to you and empty. Most people see absence or the absence of direction and they think, oh, well, I'm going to look for where the direction is. I'm going to look over there. And for him, he thought artistry or valuing something is putting yourself in that space. So he writes about the negative capability of great artists, wherein the artist, quote, is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, wherein the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. It's the courage to work with a piece of art, to not just search after answers all the time. We all have to attend school, and so we all kind of have this hammered home view of answers. If there's a problem, there's an answer, and your failure is not to find the answer. And of course, there's so much of social significance in the world that we crave after solutions to these problems. Art that wanders, that meanders, that kind of plays in that negatively capable space is art that is honest about the unanswerable parts of very important things. To be an artist is to deal with it directly and perhaps find that the real answer is that there is no answer. And what does that feel like? And what does that mean? I'm going to take meaning and I'm going to bend it. I'm going to show you how far it bends from what you thought it was. And you're going to see that it was never sturdy in the first place. That's a place of voluntary interaction with the artist struggling through something. And you struggling alongside them. Precisely because the player is directly interacting with the medium, they can interact with that challenge. The player is really just veering off in all sorts of directions. What about games that embrace that veering off, as opposed to just crashing into a wall of certainty?
Whenever someone makes art, they have to fill a space all on their own. It's this often very anxiety-inducing position to be in, to have to fill this empty space, to have to fill a blank page, to have to make something with only what you already are, instead of looking outside of yourself and simply painting by numbers and placing things where they properly belong. You have to combine your sense of ambiguity with your sense of creation, which is actually very counterintuitive sometimes. The most pure form of ambiguity is emptiness. It is an ultimate form of patience to just simply allow for things to be empty. Even when things are empty, they still have room for something real. They still have room for you to create something new. It can be confusing because it feels like, well, now am I posing too much? Am I making something that doesn't matter? Am I being indulgent? Am I making something that's unnecessary, that doesn't need to exist? If you can't be explicit about what that mark is, if you can't know what effect your art is going to have, it feels like, well, it might as well have no effect. But what an artist has to realize, at least in the process of experiencing it over and over, is that this disappointment of not knowing how your art is going to be received is exactly what art is supposed to do. It's not supposed to be a test with an answer. It's supposed to be this thing that produces what you could not have possibly set it up to produce. It is a way of discovering something. And it even does so as a mirror when you give it to someone to experience as a viewer. As someone who didn't create the art, you end up having to interpret things in an artistic way. You have to understand that it is a creative process to even insist that there is a meaning that you saw in a work. You can't say that that's objectively what it means. You can only know that it gave you something with which to experiment.
If you want the answer to be simple, you could just get it in an instant and just move on. And there's plenty of entertainment that will just give you those answers. But you could also spend hundreds of hours with a problem that doesn't have a ready solution. We have this video on The Witness, and it happens to be one of my favorites, even though it was done when we were younger and simpler in our editing skills, and in our organization was quite a bit messier. But we were struggling through the meaning of a game that lasted us like 100 hours each. What the game was trying to communicate was really actually very hard to grasp, and it couldn't be captured in a summary. If these games are going to get longer and longer in order to be worth the price, and if the budget is going to get higher and higher, we have to wonder about, well, what kinds of problems can they offer us that are worth that time, as opposed to problems that could be shortened into a bite-sized chunk. There's room for both. One of the worst things about recommending this kind of stuff is it can feel like an insult to your taste, like I'm telling you that, oh, you're not sophisticated enough for not appreciating this kind of thing. The point of the recommendation is merely an invite to an experience. It's not a replacement or a judgment on other experiences. I play all sorts of games, and I like them all. Video games are always referred to as breaks. It's escapism. Perhaps the escape sometimes is away from stimulation, away from formula. The process of appreciating these things is really just falling back on the kind of yearning that we used to have when we would take all these various steps that we would take as infants into spaces that we didn't understand, and we were embracing that not understanding. Falling back on that simplicity sometimes can be a different kind of break. Games like Journey and Sable, Death Stranding, The Witness, Outer Wilds, even something like Red Dead Redemption 2, they all enact this ineffable gift of a question lingering long after its utterance, and the fascinating fulfillment of sitting with an idea, alone, struggling with an idea for yourself. I've, like everyone, suspiciously dismissed works for wasting my time and especially for wasting my money. I've sneered at artwork made in seemingly seconds, yet I also have to receipt myself sometimes in perception of these things and wonder how much of that was from me and not from the thing itself. There is a vocabulary that can be heard, something delicate and true being communicated in language more obscure. And there is a courage in putting yourself out there by entering towards that sensitive state of embarrassing emotional vulnerability. And the key is, it's really embarrassing to be vulnerable with a work and admit to yourself that the work is being vulnerable with you too. It's almost like hearing a stranger's heart vocalized in the silence of their stare, and you're with them and you have to be okay being with them and don't look away. Some of these games are that kind of silent vocalization of something painful and hard. Float with those games. Just like the wavy figure of the Journey character flying up and up into clouds. Float forward into the tugging strands of whatever veil hides the tiny sparks of longing that were always with you anyway, and you just forgot. Perhaps we should all strive for that kind of open, vulnerable hollow of quiet.